Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
After a busy night in Brussels, the UK and the EU have at last reached an agreement on 3 key areas of Brexit, which will enable talks to move into their second phase.
That's right. After negotiations into the small hours of the morning, Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker announced significant progress on the 3 main areas of the deal, which includes a payment of up to £39 billion to the EU.
We've been working extremely hard this week, and as you've all seen, it hasn't been easy for either side. When we met on Monday, we said a deal was within reach. What we have arrived at today represents a significant improvement, and I'm grateful to the negotiating teams, led by David Davis and Michel Barnier, for their efforts. Getting to this point has required give and take on both sides. And I believe that the joint report being published is in the best interests of the whole of the UK. I very much welcome the prospect of moving ahead to the next phase, to talk about trade and security, and to discuss the positive and ambitious future relationship that is in all of our interests. The deal we've struck will guarantee the rights of more than 3 million EU citizens living in the UK and of 1 million UK citizens living in the EU. EU citizens living in the UK will have their rights enshrined in UK law and enforced by British courts. They will be able to go on living their lives as before. I was clear in Florence that we're a country that honours our obligations. After some tough conversations, we've now agreed a settlement that is fair to the British taxpayer. It means that in future we will be able to invest more in our priorities at home, such as housing, schools and the NHS. In Northern Ireland, we will guarantee there will be no hard border, and we will uphold the Belfast Agreement. Millions of jobs depend on the future trading relationship we will determine, and I'm optimistic about the discussions ahead.
Today's result is, of course, a compromise. It is the result of a long and intense discussion between the Commission negotiators and those of the UK. On the basis of the mandate which was given to me by the European Council, the Commission has just formally decided to recommend to the European Council that sufficient progress has now been made on the strict terms of the divorce.
So what has exactly been agreed? Well, there were 3 main issues, of course: the Irish border, EU citizens' rights and the Brexit divorce bill. Firstly, the report says that there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. If an agreement can't be reached, then the UK will maintain full alignment with the rules of the single market and customs union. And in a concession to the DUP, the report also says that there will be no regulatory barriers that will be introduced between Northern Ireland and the UK, that is, unless agreed by the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly. The deal has guaranteed the rights as well of 3 million EU citizens in the UK and will also secure the rights of UK citizens living in the EU. As part of the agreement, the European Courts of Justice will, in particular cases, continue to have a role in overseeing the rights of EU citizens in the UK for 8 years after our departure. And finally, the methodology for the working out of the Brexit divorce bill has been agreed on, with the exact figure thought to be between 35 million and 39 billion pounds. The UK will continue to contribute to the EU budget as if it was still a member until the end of 2020. Theresa May has said the financial settlement is fair to the British taxpayers. Well, is it? Let's speak to our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, who's outside Downing Street for us this afternoon. And Tamara, when Theresa May was speaking earlier this morning in Brussels, she said the figure had been agreed. She said it was going to be fair to the British taxpayer. She didn't give the precise details on that figure, did she, though?
That's right. I think the key thing for Theresa May today is that she's done the deal. It all looked like it was thrown into jeopardy on Monday. It's been in doubt for much of the rest of the week as she's been shuttling between the key players right up until the early hours of this morning. But she's now done that deal and she has the support of her cabinet for it. We also got, and we weren't expecting this, an official estimate of how much money we will be giving to Brussels that had been kept back stuck for now, but the Prime Minister's official spokesperson confirmed that it was between 35 and 39 billion pounds, which will be paid over quite a number of years. Now, what about the arch Brexiteers Boris Johnson and Michael Gove? Of course, Boris Johnson said the EU could go whistle for the money. Well, they've both been out, both in public and on social media, to bat for the Prime Minister and say that this is a really significant achievement. Here is Michael Gove speaking earlier today.
I think, significant achievement, because it means that the rights of EU citizens are protected in the UK, the rights of UK citizens are protected in the EU. We have an agreement that no EU country will be out of pocket as a result of our departure, but there will be more money for the NHS and for schools and for housing in this country as a result of our leaving the EU. And also we can now get on to talking about that free trade deal. So it's a significant step forward, and it's one which I think the overwhelming majority of people in Parliament and in the country will welcome.
We're going to head to Brussels now. There is a news conference. That's the MEP Guy Verhofstadt, the European Parliament's Brexit coordinator.
The European Parliament on Wednesday, and afterwards, also on Wednesday, will be voted in the plenary. This resolution is the third resolution of the European Parliament, and it makes an assessment of the state of the negotiations between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and is an assessment that is positive in the sense that we conclude in the resolution, in the first part, that a lot of requests that the Parliament has put forward have been achieved in this negotiation. And you can find in the progress report of both negotiating parties. On citizens' rights, and it was crucial for us, all rights and all benefits will be covered. So no exceptions for some of the benefits, no exceptions of some of the citizens of, for example, family of the European citizens. Also, there is no mention anymore of something that, in our point of view, was hugely critical, the so-called settled status that the UK side offered. Important is also that there will be direct effect of these rights in the UK and in UK law, and that there is also a role of the ECJ, of the European Court of Justice, and when the European Court of Justice is acting, is deciding that this opinion is binding inside the UK legal system. Secondly, on financial settlement, all obligations will be covered, as indicated also in the first resolution of the European Parliament at the beginning. And finally, on Ireland, no hardening of the border. A system of regulatory alignment will be in place, and the Good Friday Agreement in all its parts will be respected. So our recommendation to the European Council is now to go to phase 2 of the negotiations. And that will be an important statement by the European Parliament in the resolution next week. Nevertheless, the resolution will also enlighten you and mention a number of outstanding issues that, in our point of view, needs to be tackled before an orderly withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union. And that for us are key to give our consent on the withdrawal agreement, because you know how the procedure will be. From now on, once in phase 2, the withdrawal agreement needs to be written down. And we want that 5 outstanding issues are dealt with by doing so, by detailing this withdrawal agreement. These 5 outstanding issues are the following. The first is that the coverage of the citizens' rights needs also to be extended to future partners. It can be spouses, it can be other partners, but it needs to be extended to future partners. The second is that we want to be sure that in the withdrawal agreement there is a light touch, declaratory in nature procedure, free of charge for the citizens, and placing in fact the burden of proof on the Home Office, on the UK authorities to challenge the declaration, and also a procedure that makes it possible that a family initiates the procedure with one single form. So if there are 3 children, men and women, not 5 forms, 1 form. The third is that we want to be sure that in practice the CJEU, so the decisions by the European Court in relation to the interpretation of the citizens' rights, is binding. In all opinion, it's binding already in the progress report as it is written down today. But we are 100% sure that it is also the case, not in the written report, but also in the withdrawal agreement itself. And also that there is an important role for the future independent national authority, the so-called ombudsman, that will be created in the UK to act and to give a follow-up to the complaints of the citizens.
Including go to court for them.
Including to go to court if it is necessary. The fourth outstanding issue on this is guaranteeing naturally the free movement also of the UK citizens in the 27 member states in the EU who are currently residing in the EU 27. Because we have always said we are not only defending the rights of the EU citizens living in Britain, we are also defending the rights of the UK citizens living on the continent. And we need to be sure that there is freedom of residence and movement for these UK citizens in the whole 27. And finally, also ensuring that the commitments that are made with respect to Northern Ireland and Ireland are fully enforceable. So we are very pleased with everything what is read in the progress report on Northern Ireland, but we want to be sure that these commitments are also enforceable in practice by provisions in the withdrawal agreement. So our recommendation to the Council is based on this to go into phase 2 of the negotiations. Secondly, in any way to understand and take note of the fact that there are in all 5 outstanding issues and concerns that need to be addressed in the withdrawal agreement itself, and that will be for the Parliament essential before giving our consent to that agreement. Finally, very short, because you're going to read it and we're going to come back to this. On the future, what you're going to see in the resolution, that Parliament also give a first framework of how the future relationship with the UK could be. We recall the idea of the association agreement, the 4 pillars in such an agreement, and we also, you're going to find it in the resolution, the 8 principles on which, in our point of view, such an agreement and such a close partnership with the UK should be established. Finally, you will find also in the same resolution next week on the table of the European Parliament our opinion about the transition. Transition for us means that the full acquis, as we call it, will be applicable in this period of transition, with all the oversights that exist, budgetary oversight, financial oversight, legal oversight, and so on. So for us, no possibility to start picking and choosing inside the acquis during the transition. So that's the summary. We have also got this morning, I have to tell you that the briefing by Michel Barnier and by his whole team. We have congratulated him also for this progress report. And I think it's very important that next week the Parliament, as the first institution, will give his recommendation to go to phase 2, but also will already indicate the outstanding points to be addressed before the agreement can be put in action after the approval by the Parliament. Hammer?
Thank you. I have only to.
Well, that's the MEP Guy Verhofstadt, the European Parliament's Brexit coordinator, really highlighting the main points of this Brexit deal, talking about a number of outstanding issues, but he concludes by saying our recommendation is to move forward into phase 2. Let's go to Brussels, join Sky correspondent Michelle Clifford. Michelle, it's a number of hours now since this deal was announced. What's the sense you're getting in Brussels about how it's gone down?
I certainly think in terms of the institutions, the officials here, there's a great deal of relief. There was frustration and concern. You saw this morning Michel Barnier, Jean-Paul Juncker, also Donald Tusk, all saying this is good, we've got to this point, we can move on to phase 2, but also making the point there's a great deal of work to be done. There are many outstanding issues, and certainly we've heard from organisations, for example, representing British citizens in the European Union, saying they're not very happy at all. They think it's a very bad deal, and there are many issues in terms of citizens' rights that are still outstanding. Now, a man who's got some very strong opinions on what has happened and the move to phase 2 is the gentleman standing beside me, Michael Bellingham, who's actually the chief executive of the Pet Food Manufacturers Association. You happened to be in Brussels today, visiting the European Commission, visiting the Irish and the British delegations here to get some answers in terms of trade and worries for you in the future. How did you feel about being here today and what you got to hear today?
It was extraordinary waking up in the morning and seeing Theresa May flying over and then hearing the announcements and us happening to be here. We'd pre-arranged the meetings, but we were so fortunate that the Commission still agreed to see us, and we were very happy that the way things are moving forward. We've certainly been extremely concerned about lack of progress. I mean, the 60 million pets in the UK did not vote for Brexit, and they still want to have high welfare standards. They still want to have the products they have access to now. And so we're relieved that we're moving forward, because we felt that we were going to have some of the companies in the UK, we're going to have to take some decisions based on this potential cliff edge. And hopefully now this gives us a bit of relief, and we have some sort of transitional period which allows us to put those things into place that we need to do.
You're alluding there to issues to do with regulations, to do with trade going forward, or the negotiations going forward. But you also mentioned to me that for your organisation there was a real worry in terms of citizens' rights, EU citizens' rights in the UK. Give us a sense of that.
Well, I mean, people may not be aware that if you're producing pet food, it's using meat come from animals that are slaughtered under veterinary supervision. So that's all meat, and then we use the byproducts. But those vets, over 90% of them are from the EU, and so we were really concerned that their rights, their future needed to be sorted out. I'm hoping this will be the case. I mean, over 30% of all vets are from the EU, and they're looking after our pets and our animals. So hopefully they are given encouragement to stay, and we need them in the UK.
And I know that you have manufacturers and producers both sides of the Irish border. In terms of what was presented today on the border, there are lots of outstanding issues. We still don't really know what's going to happen there. Are you concerned?
Well, I would be concerned if this started to unravel quickly, but I think we absolutely need to ensure that there is no hard border. I have members in the north of Ireland, and they take byproducts from the south. They utilise them and then they send them back again if they've got a market there. So we cannot have a hard border in the north, because that's how business works, and it would be hugely problematic otherwise.
Michael Bellingham, thank you very much indeed. So it looks like, if it's sanctioned by the European Council next week, that things will move to phase 2, that the discussions about initially transition and then trade can proceed, but as I was saying earlier, lots of issues still outstanding, and that's going to complicate this second phase, because that was already going to be even more difficult than the first phase, and we've now got things hanging over from the first phase going into that second phase. It's going to be very difficult.
Thank you, Michelle.
Well, it's on that border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which has been central in these talks and negotiations, the moving on of that. Let's go to Dublin now to speak to our Dublin correspondent, Darren McCaffrey. And Darren, so far, the leader of the DUP, Arlene Foster, she's welcomed the move. She said more work does need to be done. What's the reaction been like in the Republic today?
Well, there is quite a contrast in some ways between the language of the DUP, who, yes, accepted the deal but want further clarity, and Ireland, who feel that they have achieved all of the goals. That's what the Taoiseach Leo Varadkar said today. You have to remember what 3 weeks ago wanted some written guarantees from Britain when it came to the Good Friday Agreement, when it came to the Common Travel Area, and of course not wanting a hard border. And you'd have to say, given that they are now written down on a piece of paper, agreed in principle, that Ireland has got what it wanted. This is the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, speaking at a news conference this morning.
We have achieved all that we set out to achieve in phase one of these negotiations. We have the assurances and guarantees we need from the United Kingdom and support for them from the European Union. I am satisfied that sufficient progress has now been made on the Irish issues. The parameters have been set and they are good. Now we can move on to work out the detail of what has been agreed, to talk about the transition phase, free trade and the new relationship between the EU and the UK.
Now, it will all depend, of course, as Leo Varadkar was saying there, on the detail, but at least in principle, the Irish think that this agreement today signifies a movement towards a softer Brexit. They would argue that if there is a trade deal reached between the United Kingdom and the EU, given the border issue, it will have to ensure that there will be no hard border. So by its very essence, it would be a good trade agreement and soft. Or the alternative is, the backup plan, if there is no agreement, that ultimately there will be full regulatory alignment between the UK and the EU. Again, a softer form of Brexit. So overall, Dublin are pretty pleased. In fact, Simon Coveney, the Foreign Minister, suggested the nation was relieved today that finally the talks will be moving on to phase two.
OK, I'm Dan McCaffrey in Dublin. Thank you.
So Theresa May landed in Brussels shortly before 6 a.m. this morning to finalise a new draft agreement between Britain and the EU, having negotiated by phone into the early hours with key players, including the leader of Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, Arlene Foster. At a joint press conference with the Prime Minister this morning, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said he is satisfied that the fabled sufficient progress has now been achieved, meaning talks can move on to trade and transition in the new year, barring any last-minute upsets, and who in all of this would entirely rule that out. The deal, though, should be signed off at next week's meeting of European leaders.
We've been working extremely hard this week, and as you've all seen, it hasn't been easy for either side. When we met on Monday, we said a deal was within reach. What we have arrived at today represents a significant improvement, and I'm grateful to the negotiating teams, led by David Davis and Michel Barnier, for their efforts. Getting to this point has required give and take on both sides. And I believe that the joint report being published is in the best interests of the whole of the UK. I very much welcome the prospect of moving ahead to the next phase, to talk about trade and security, and to discuss the positive and ambitious future relationship that is in all of our interests.
On the basis of the mandate which was given to me by the European Council, the Commission has just formally decided to recommend to the European Council that sufficient progress has now been made on the strict terms of the divorce.
While being satisfied with today's agreement, which is obviously the personal success of Prime Minister Theresa May, let us remember that the most difficult challenge is still ahead. We all know that breaking up is hard, but breaking up and building a new relation is much harder.
Donald Tusk there. Camilla, can Theresa May rightly claim personal success for this?
Well, they say a week's a long time in politics, and if you compare where she is now to where she was at least 48 hours ago, where I think actually senior Brexiteers were ready to really perhaps be a little more disloyal than they have been in being very vehement about the fact that they felt she might have been rolling over, that they felt it was going in the wrong direction. You had Jacob Rees-Mogg obviously talking about the pinkening of her red lines at PMQs, Peter Bone making a joke about did she need him to accompany her out there to secure the negotiations, and the DUP being thanked for securing a better future in terms of Brexiteers, I think that things have changed. And I think the fact that she's been personally congratulated by Tusk and as well by Juncker, that didn't show in that speech there, but he also said it was a personal victory for her, I think takes her into a much better position this weekend than she may have been.
Right. Do you think the people that you just mentioned, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Peter Bone and the likes, they are on board, are they now?
Well, so far, actually, Leave Means Leave haven't released a statement yet, and they represent all of these Brexiteers. On one hand, I think we've heard from Farage this morning and some of the others who seem to be on the more extremist end of Brexit, who obviously aren't going to be happy, just as those on the extremist end of any debate are often not happy with what seems to be a compromise. I think the EU has met us a long way when it comes to ECJ. I think there's been some concessions made by this side. I think so-called pragmatic Brexiteers will probably be saying to themselves, well, it's not perfect, but it's better than where we thought we were earlier in the week. And equally, I think you've got a situation where people are accepting that in a compromised series of negotiations, no one's going to be 100% happy. And in fact, if anyone was 100% happy, that would mean that the negotiations were too far weighted in one favour or the other.
I mean, it has been a Herculean task to get all the different strands on board. The Irish government, the EU, they're on the same side. You've got the DUP, you've got both wings of the Conservative Party, and she's managed it.
She's managed it. They have all managed it. The Europeans have been very keen to keep the praise they've lavished on her, to keep her there, because they're afraid that they could get something much worse if she was unseated. And as you were saying earlier this week, it really looked as if the hard Brexiteers might have pushed her off her seat. But in the end, all they've done is kick the can down the road. We know we have a guarantee of a soft border. We have this alignment right across the whole European Union in terms of
if the trade deal isn't actually secured. It's the fallback option, isn't it? Full alignment for the whole of the UK.
Yes, but you can't have both things. If you have alignment, it has to be near as done it in the customs union rules.
But I think
because hang on a minute, wait a minute. If it's got to be very close. The French and everybody else has said you can't have an open border, you can't have a soft border unless you have almost identical trading agreements, in which case most of the Remainers will be reasonably happy because they know we're going to leave the European Union anyway. What they're really worried about is divorcing ourselves from the single market and the customs union. And if, in effect, we're more or less staying in it to keep the border open, then they're happy. But when that becomes clear, the other lot won't be. The Peter Bones and
we're going to
will explode.
Well, and we're going to pick over it, just like a dog with a bone, later in the programme. So the deal came before dawn, allowing Theresa May and her negotiating partners in Brussels a chance to smile over croissant and orange juice. But what exactly did they agree? Well, the report makes the commitment that there will be no hard border between the UK and the Republic of Ireland. It's unclear how this will be achieved, but in the absence of agreement on the issue between the EU and UK during trade negotiations, it says the UK will maintain full alignment with EU rules in areas relating to Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement and the Common Travel Area will be upheld. EU citizens living in the UK and vice versa will have their rights to live, work and study guaranteed. UK courts will preside over enforcing the rights of EU citizens in Britain, but can refer unclear cases to ultimate arbiter of union law, the European Court of Justice, for 8 years after the UK's withdrawal. In terms of the money, no specific final figure is mentioned, but the two parties have agreed a formula to calculate the financial settlement. The UK has made a number of financial commitments, including paying into the EU budget as usual in 2019-20, as well as its pension contributions liabilities. The report will have to be agreed upon by the European Council summit next Thursday and Friday before negotiations about the UK's future relationship with the EU can start. We're joined now from Brussels by our correspondent Kevin Connolly. Kevin, everybody talks about give and take. Who's given more and who's taken more?
Look, the Europeans are going to feel that they have got an awful lot of what they wanted out of the British. For example, the idea that Britain didn't owe the European Union a penny has been quietly shelved. I mean, I suppose that's the most spectacular example of what Brussels would see as a shifting of ground on the British side. The UK can point to some areas where the European Union has rowed back at one point those European agencies which are being moved from London to other European cities as a result of Brexit. The EU was going to ask the British side to pay all the costs of that removal process. That seems to have gone away, so Britain can point to concessions. And I think, of course, it's critical for Theresa May that this doesn't look like a process where Britain is a supplicant or where it's trying to pass a series of tests set by the European Union, but rather that it is a genuine negotiation. I think there's enough on both sides that that argument can be plausibly made, but there's no doubt, of course, that the European Union has an enormous amount of power in this relationship, because the great prize for Theresa May, the thing we can now start to talk about, is that trade negotiation. I'm going to miss the phrase sufficient progress, because we seem to have been saying it on a daily basis now for 9 months, but sufficient progress has now been made. And of course, you know, as people like Donald Tusk and Michel Barnier are already warning, the next bit is the really hard bit. It took the European Union 7 years to negotiate a free trade agreement with friendly, liberal, reasonable Canada. So it's not going to be easy, but at least it is now underway, and a timetable has been stuck to and a deadline has been met. So what looked, frankly, at the start of this week like a rather wobbly, uncertain process now looks a bit better managed, a bit smoother, and a bit more predictable from the Brussels point of view. So there's, you know, a palpable sense of relief here this morning.
Kevin Connolly in Brussels, thank you very much. Well, we're joined here by the Brexit Minister, Steve Baker. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Listen, it hasn't been easy, has it, reaching this point? If we just look at this week, the Prime Minister thought she had a deal, an agreement on Monday, and then the DUP withdrew support. Last night, she had to fly to Brussels in the middle of the night, it seemed, in order to get that agreement to go on to the next phase. How do you think the next bit's going to go?
I think it's going to be a very interesting time to be in politics and public policy.
Well, that much we know.
But what I think is going to happen is that we're going to accelerate our capacity in the negotiations. You saw some of our future relationship papers over the summer, and what I would expect to see is an increase in negotiating capacity and acceleration in the progress that we make.
All right, well, let's turn to the implementation period. Have the EU now finally agreed to one, and how long will it be?
Well, we need to get onto the future relationship negotiations before we can agree an implementation period. So that's something we need to do after the Council.
Right, but there is going to be an implementation period.
But as you know, that is the government's policy, and I'm glad that it is.
Right, but you don't know how long it's going to be.
Well, we expect it to be 2 years, but as the Prime Minister has explained, it's about how long we need to do the practical things which lead to the best possible exit.
So it could be longer than 2 years?
Well, we expect it to be 2 years.
I mean, during this implementation period, as I understand it, the UK will remain in the single market and the customs union, and the European Council guidelines for the future relationship say that.
So what the Prime Minister explained in the Florence speech is that we would continue in the implementation period within the framework of current EU law. But a point which has not often been made here is that in order to conclude the future relationship agreement, we need to be outside the treaties, which is a matter of EU law. So the trick is to leave the sphere of treaty law and be outside the EU without changing all the practical arrangements, so that we have that period of stability and continuity within which everyone can adjust.
Right, well, I've got the Council guidelines here in front of me, and they are talking about transitional arrangements. And it says, in order to ensure a level playing field based on the same rules applying throughout the single market, changes to the acquis adopted by EU institutions and bodies will have to apply both in the United Kingdom and the EU. All existing union regulatory, budgetary, supervisory, judiciary and enforcement instruments and structures will also apply. Do you agree?
Well, as you know, we don't comment on leaked documents, but what you've just read out is consistent.
It is leaked, but this is the General Secretariat of the Council, the European Council draft guidelines. It is extremely clear.
So what you've just read out is consistent with what the Prime Minister's previously said. It's also consistent with what the European Union has previously said. But what I would say is, as your correspondent just pointed out, there is space for everyone to move considerably through this process. The point here is that we have...
Which bits will change, Steve Baker? Would freedom of movement continue during that 2-year transition period?
The point is that we have managed to achieve sufficient progress in a way which is, I think, broadly being welcomed, and that means we can get onto the future relationship conversation in order to agree a future relationship which is in everyone's best interest.
Right, and that future relationship would include signing new trade deals, for example, in the future, but not during this transition period. Do you accept that Britain will not be able to strike any new trade deals until March 2021 at the earliest?
So the issue here is when you can start negotiating them and when you put them into place.
Yes.
So within
So
the framework of the implementation period, I think we all expect that we would not be able to implement new trade arrangements with other countries during the implementation period.
So 2021 would be the earliest?
I would expect us to start negotiating during the implementation period for conclusion after the implementation.
Right, but you could scope them up until that point,
I would expect we would get on with a great deal of detailed work through Liam Fox's department.
And freedom of movement will continue until March 2021?
So the position at the moment is, in the withdrawal agreement that's been set out, that the date which is relevant to the agreement which has been struck is exit day. But we will need to get on and talk about the future relationship before any of those things have been agreed.
But do you accept, they've said there, you will have to sign up to all of the agreements, including the 4 freedoms, if you're going to remain part of the customs union and the single market until transition is finished?
Well, Joe, you're asking me to comment on leaked documents, and as I've said, we don't do that. What we need to do is to get into the future.
Would you accept that, though? Would you personally accept, if that does become reality, that the UK will still have freedom of movement up until 2021?
Joe, what I'm going to do is celebrate that we've achieved sufficient progress and that we'll be able to get into those future relationship negotiations. We will get through those negotiations knowing what our objectives are, and then we will conclude a relationship. And I'll take a judgment like every other member of Parliament, every member of the public, when we see what's been agreed.
So it's not a red line? Freedom of movement could continue?
We're very clear that we're going to be taking back control of our laws, our borders, our money, our trade policy.
Yes.
What we need to do is get into the future relationship agreement and draw conclusions.
But you've just said it's not a red line. You're going to take a judgment. You'll make a judgment. The freedom of movement you will take in the round along with everything else, including that new trade deal.
The Prime Minister's very clear that we're taking back control of our migration policy. Right. There is a migration bill coming forwards, but people watching this programme will understand that we've just moved from one testing negotiation in order to move into the next phase of a testing negotiation. And it's not for me now, as a minister in the government, to preempt that long negotiation.
Right, so there are no red lines, let's put it like that.
Of course there are red lines.
Well, what are they?
They're the ones the Prime Minister set out in her Lancaster House speech, in her Florence speech.
But they don't apply to the implementation period?
Well, we've been very clear that the implementation period needs to be conducted within the current framework of EU rules as set out by the Prime Minister.
Including those things I've just set out, like freedom of movement and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice.
These are going to be matters for negotiation once we get on beyond this Council.
Right,
For the moment, what we need to do, Joe, is go forward with this agreement to the Council.
I understand.
To have the other nations of Europe agree with us. It's in all our interests to move forward and have these discussions.
All right, let's talk about the European Court of Justice, because, again, in this document, but also in discussions, there has been agreement by the UK that the European Court of Justice will continue to have a role as being the arbiter on EU citizens' rights, and that will continue till 2021.
You've got a number of documents. You mean the withdrawal agreement?
Well, I mean the agreement that you've signed up to.
So the withdrawal agreement's very clear that there's a voluntary, limited role for our courts to refer cases to the European Court so that we can establish a body of case law within the withdrawal agreement.
But let's just keep it simple for our viewers. The ECJ, the European Court of Justice, will continue to have a role as the ultimate arbiter beyond transition for 8 years.
So the direct jurisdiction of the Court of Justice will end. There will be a capacity for our courts to make a voluntary referral to the Court of Justice
that's
on
not
case law where there's a gap in case law, on the body of law as it exists on exit day.
All right,
and I think that is a reasonable thing to do to give citizens certainty.
Oh, it may well be.
As the withdrawal agreement beds in, so that we can all understand that case law on the withdrawal agreement is being consistently interpreted. And I think that is a civilised and decent thing to do for European citizens, which I would have thought that people who took the view we should treat people well would welcome.
Right, and you may well be right, but it wasn't what we were led to believe by some of your colleagues who said that every single aspect of the ECJ would end when we leave.
Well, this is a negotiation, and we've worked through a range of complex issues, and we've reached a position which I am very happy to accept, much as we would many of us would have liked to keep things very simple for everybody. But the reality is that we need to do what is right by European citizens, and we've agreed this mechanism of voluntary, limited referral on narrow grounds, which I think is reasonable as we establish the case law of the withdrawal agreement.
All right, let's talk about the agreement, the full alignment, this term that has been used in order to get agreement from the Democratic Unionist Party. What does it mean?
So the first thing to say about it is it refers to a fallback scenario in the event that we don't reach a quality future relationship agreement, because we want to honour the Belfast Agreement and ensure that North-South cooperation on the island of Ireland continues.
Right.
So things like the single energy market, it's important for everyone on the island of Ireland that it should continue. And so this is about a fallback position. It's not about where we want to go. The document's extremely clear that the United Kingdom will preserve its political and its economic integrity, that the United Kingdom will leave the customs union and the single market.
Right, but what does full alignment mean? It is a fallback position, so we have to take it into account and consider it. You've said the integrity of the UK will stay in its entirety, so does that full alignment with customs and with standards of the EU apply to the whole of the UK in that fallback scenario?
So I'm expecting us to discuss all of these issues when we get onto the future relationship discussions.
So it could?
So I would expect us to agree objectives and then regulatory recognition, which is a standard practice in trade agreements, so that we have a capacity, as the Prime Minister again set out in the Florence speech, to sometimes agree on what we want to achieve and how we do it, and sometimes to agree that we will differ in how we meet the same shared objectives.
But in order to keep that soft, open border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, you accept that in that fallback position, we, as a country, will be signed up to the standards and regulations and customs of the EU.
What I accept, Jo, is that we've had a great success this week.
I know that, but you are not answering the questions about what has actually been agreed.
Jo, I would have thought you would welcome that we've got onto the future relationship agreement, which will allow us to resolve some of these issues collaboratively and jointly in everyone's mutual interests as we go through the rest of the year.
How did you get the Democratic Unionist Party to agree to this when they were so unhappy just a few days ago?
I wasn't party to the conversation with the Democratic Unionists, but they have, as they've explained, I saw Arlene Foster on the television explain that there have been a number of changes, in particular the commitment to maintaining the constitutional and economic integrity of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland.
Right, let's talk about the money just briefly. Philip Hammond says we will be paying that divorce settlement bill even without a trade deal. Is that right?
But the situation is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
So he's wrong?
But the situation is, as it says in the agreement, that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. We're a rule of law nation state which wishes to honour its commitments which we've incurred in the course of our membership, but we are moving through this negotiation in a spirit of goodwill, wishing to set up a new partnership which serves us all.
Right. So when Philip Hammond said that he would find it inconceivable that we wouldn't actually pay for our obligations and our contributions, even if we didn't secure a free trade deal, did he misspeak?
Well, we're proceeding in a spirit of cooperation, looking towards our future relationship. And in those circumstances, we would expect to meet our commitments which we have entered into, and to move forward into that new relationship, and these things go together. So I think what we need to do is focus on a process of moving through the negotiation to land in a place which suits everyone.
Right, I'm still not clear. Will we pay the £45 billion that has been talked about in the divorce settlement, whether we get a trade deal or not?
I'm not expecting to pay a figure as high as £45 billion is the first thing.
All right, 40 billion then.
But what we're expecting to do is to move through into a process where we conclude a relationship in everyone's best interests, and that is where all of us should be focusing our efforts.
Polly Toynbee, listening to Steve Baker there, do you think it is clear that there are no more red lines in the negotiations that are now going to proceed?
I'm delighted to hear that it really sounds as if there aren't. I mean, I was on the Daily Politics with Steve before he became a minister. Wonderful, these magical transformations when he was an adamant leaver, and he would not have accepted paying significant amount of money, still remaining under the ECJ. After all, the ECJ has only ever had a small role.
We won't be under the ECJ.
Above all, alignment such as we can have a soft border with Ireland, which is a very good thing. DUP were absolutely right about that. Quite right that it has to be across the whole country. But that alignment means, in effect, more or less, staying in the single market and the customs union. If that's what happens, I will be delighted.
Right, will we? And can you guarantee that the whole of the UK...
I don't think I've changed my views in any substantial way. I've always been a rule of law conservative. I've always understood that we would want to go forward and have a cooperative relationship. What I've wanted to do is change the structure of that relationship. But what I would expect to happen, in particular, by the way, it's a mischaracterisation to talk about being under the ECJ. We will not be under the ECJ. The direct jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice will come to an end and we will control our own laws.
All right.
What I've explained in some detail, I'm sorry it's slightly complex, but in some detail I've explained that what we need to do is have the capacity for a voluntary referral to establish the case law of the withdrawal agreement on the narrow question of citizens' rights, where they've already exercised.
Polly, we're going to
cases that ever went to the ECJ.
Polly, we're going to have to move on at this point. But
we're going to have control.
Just before I let you go, you said that figure of £45 billion that I put to you was way over. What is it then? What should it be in your mind?
Well, there's going to be a technical briefing which will explain more of this, but we're going to go through our budget contributions, which we've already committed to. I would expect it to be less.
All right, Steve Baker, thank you. Now, how has the deal been received by those within the Labour Party, arguing for the closest possible relationship with the EU after Brexit? Well, Chuka Umunna from the campaign group Open Britain joins me now from South London. Chuka, do you welcome this agreement?
Well, I'm pleased we're moving to the next phase. It's about time. The government has wasted a lot of time so far. We're 18 months into this process, halfway through the whole process, and very little progress in the overall scheme of things has been made. So, yeah, I'm pleased. But, I mean, it's interesting listening to Steve Baker there, radically trying to repaint the red lines which were set out in the Prime Minister's speech at Lancaster House last January. If you go back to all the things she said, you know, there would be no adherence to European Court of Justice rulings. Clearly that's going to be the case in respect of EU citizens' rights in the document that has just been released by the Commission. We were told there wouldn't be huge contributions into the EU budget. We will be contributing into the EU budget until 2020. And of course there's a big divorce bill, which in some respects was the price of being able to move to the next stage of over £40 billion.
So what should the Labour Party, what should the Labour leadership under Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer when it comes to Brexit, what should their position be now?
Well, it's very clear that in order to be able to get the exact same economic benefits as we enjoy at the moment in the European Union once we've left, we need to stay in the single market and the customs union permanently. A lot has been talked about transition. Business has asked for a decent transition period, quite understandably so. But of course, what transition does is it simply delays jumping off the cliff if you don't have proper arrangements in place afterwards.
Right, so do you expect,
is no safe harbour.
Do you expect to hear that now from the shadow team in your party, that they should commit to staying in the single market and the customs union?
Well, I'm very pleased to hear Keir Starmer say at the dispatch box this week that we think all these options should stay on the table. So I think that's very encouraging indeed. I, of course, would like us to just go that bit further and be absolutely clear that we are seeking to stay in the customs union and the single market permanently. But the big thing here, Joe, is, of course, every time this moved forward, this process, we see new facts emerging. That big divorce bill that Steve Baker's just been trying to kind of dismiss almost, that was not what people thought that they were going to be voting for. And of course, if you're paying that big divorce bill, which we will be paying, you're not going to get the £350 million extra per week going to the NHS, which was central to the campaign that Steve Baker was part of. And, you know, you go back to many of the other things that were said. I remember when Tony Blair and John Major went to Northern Ireland as part of that referendum campaign, and people said when they were talking up potential problems with the Irish border, they were engaging in Project Fear. Well, I mean, that's absolutely dominated proceedings in these negotiations over the last couple of weeks.
All right.
So every time we move forward, new facts are presenting themselves. And that's why I think certainly we have to have an open mind about what happens at the end of this process.
Well, do you have an open mind on the agreement? Well, hang on, Chuck. Do you have an open mind on the agreement that has been reached? Because the DUP and the Irish government, as well as the EU generally, are on board at this point, and there seems to be a commitment and broad agreement that there will be this open border will be retained, as will the integrity of the UK going forward. Surely you're happy about that?
Yes, absolutely. But my central argument here is there's going to be a lot of focus on government competence, how long this has taken. But the simple fact is that Brexit, in the terms it was sold to the British people, is proving impossible to deliver.
Well, that's what compromise is about, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. But let's not forget, I wasn't the one setting the red lines in this process at the start. It was people like the Minister Steve Baker and his Prime Minister who were setting out all these ridiculous red lines, which has meant that we've waited all this time, because at the end of the day they have committed to this document. They committed to the concept of alignment. The whole reason people like Steve Baker, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and others were arguing for us to leave the European Union was to enable divergence. Now they've just agreed to alignment. Why are we going through this whole process?
All right. Thank you very much, Chuka Amuna. Well, we've heard from some Brexit-supporting MPs from within the Conservative Party this morning, and on the whole, they've given the deal a cautious welcome. But what of the self-styled guard dogs of Brexit, UKIP? Well, their party leader, Henry Bolton, joins me now. Do you want to join the queue of Conservative MPs who are congratulating the Prime Minister and the government on this agreement?
No, absolutely not. No, and good afternoon. No, I mean, what this is a total sort of surrender to the European Commission. And in fact, having worked in Brussels for 3 years, I recognise the style of the document that's been produced, and I would say 80 to 90% of it was actually drafted in Brussels. Of course, we don't know that, but that's my guess.
But the prize is a trade deal is now going to be negotiated, and if Britain is successful in that, surely it'll have your support.
Yes, but if there is no agreement, then we stay under full alignment. And full alignment means effectively that we are tied to the customs union, to the single market, and therefore to the European Courts of Justice in that regard. But also
Steve Baker's just said we won't stay in the
immigration.
customs union. Steve Baker has just said we will not stay in the customs union or the single market, and that this full alignment is a fallback, I should say, option, and will only apply to certain areas that are agreed in the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah, but that's not actually correct, because first of all, I mean, yeah, we may not be part of it, but what we will be having to do is comply with it in every respect. So we won't have the freedom to move off it if that's in the best interests of the country. For example, in terms of trade deals and so on, and aligning ourselves to the requirements of other export markets. But with regards to the Good Friday Agreement to the Northern Irish border, that's the start of all this. Well, first of all, the British government and we have never asked for, the UK has never asked for a border there. What Theresa May has allowed to happen is that the European Commission, who want an external border to the European Union, want us to come up with a solution there. But what we've agreed to do in this agreement, or what the government has agreed to do, is obviously align for Northern Ireland. But then by the following, that's I think paragraph 49, paragraph 50 of this agreement actually says that the UK will not actually implement any barrier to alignment between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK.
Right, but
and therefore we're tied to we are fully tied to it as the entire UK. And I don't support in any way, absolutely oppose anything that provides an obstacle between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK.
But the point is, Henry Bolton, you are a lone voice, really. I mean, UKIP has, to some extent, been marginalised. And if Eurosceptic Tory MPs and ministers have signed up to this, then your words are going to fall on deaf ears.
I don't think so. I mean, there's a fair observation, but the thing is, they're all aligning behind this because the Tory party are in such a mess over this. We've had a sequence of rather disastrous political and diplomatic events over the last week.
Well, they're all united, aren't they?
Well, they're united because they want to preserve the Conservative Party in power, and that's what this is.
Well, they
about.
may say that's the point of them.
That's why Steve. But it's why Steve Baker is trying to sell this as the headline issue. Isn't it good news that there's an agreement? Well, you know, unfortunately, what they're relying on is that 99% of the population won't actually read the small print, and the small print says you've basically made an agreement where you're going to be handing over a whole load of money that we're still not going to have control over our immigration. We're still going to be tied, even if not actually intrinsically members of. We're going to be tied to the European, to the common market, the single market, and the customs union, and therefore the ECJ.
Okay.
So there is no withdrawal from this, and there's no end state to it either, or any incentive to reach a further agreement.
Henry Bolton, thank you very much. Before I move on to my next guest, Camilla, your observations so far, having listened to Steve Baker, who was always described as an arch Eurosceptic, and also to Henry Bolton of UKIP, do they matter?
First of all, I think we need to have further discussion of what this full alignment means, because it's lost the word regulatory, which means it's open to much wider legal interpretation when the time comes. And as you've pointed out, and Steve Baker did, is a fallback position. Second of all, I think we also need to look at the fact that when Polly said we'd kicked the issue to the curb a little bit, we've put it into the long grass because we need to get to the next stage. That was because the government always started from a position that you couldn't discuss the Northern Ireland border issue unless you were discussing the trade agreement. So they have achieved something in that they've moved that particular plank of discussions to the next stage because they belong there. Therefore, I think when we break this down, because it's actually getting quite complex and technical, let's just think about what readers will think. Readers
or viewers in our case.
My readers, your viewers. They will be concerned with the price that's put on this. And obviously, 40 billion is being bandied around. And what I'm interested in is what price people will find acceptable. Will the Brexiteer readers of our newspaper think that it's short-term pain for long-term gain?
All right.
Well, staying with the deal over phase one of the Brexit negotiations, after talks which lasted into the small hours of this morning, Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker announced that significant progress has been made on the three main parts of the deal. It includes the UK making a payment of up to £39 billion to the EU. Well, joining me to discuss this is George Eaton, political editor of the New Statesman and director of Freedom Association and Better Off Out, Rory Broomfield. George, Rory, really good to see you both. George, if I could firstly start with you, winners and losers for you?
I think the Brexiteers are the losers from this, in that although Brexit is going to happen, I think today's deal has made it harder for Remainers to stop Brexit. The Leavers are not delivering the Brexit they wanted or that they promised. I'll give you three examples. They said first that Britain would be able to negotiate a new trade deal with the EU at the same time as negotiating its divorce. That didn't happen. They backed down on that on the first day. Number two, they said that no transitional deal would be required, that the UK would have a new trade deal secured within the 2-year Article 50 negotiating process. They've had to back down on that. There's now going to be a 2-year period from 2019 in which, as Theresa May once remarked in a different context, nothing will change. The UK will be out of the EU but will continue to have to abide by all of its laws. And then number three, on the divorce bill, when the figure of around 40 billion was floated, David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, described it as made up. Boris Johnson said Brussels could go and whistle if they expected the UK to pay that amount. Today, as was mentioned before, Downing Street has said the UK will indeed pay a sum of nearly 40 billion, 35 to 39 billion to the EU. So those are three fronts on which the Brexiteers have had to defer to reality.
Rory, fair points by George. This isn't the Brexiteers were hoping for?
Well, it wasn't the Brexit that Remainers were hoping for, of course. The idea, I think, using your analogy of winners and losers, I think it's more of a score-draw at the moment and possibly going into injury time, because there are three areas that George highlights on the judicial elements, and there's obviously the realignment with Northern Ireland and potential regulatory divergence, but also there's the money, and he's right to come on to that because there is a real issue there where the government has, of course, agreed that they will be paying a large sum of money into the billions. But with that, we're still leaving the European Union. And the idea is that in the few years that will come going forward, we'll be able to set our own legal policy, we'll be able to set our own laws, and indeed take back control.
But not immediately, Rory.
That is absolutely true, and there's concerns about whether the UK in the transition deal will be able to diverge at all. Obviously, the famous line in this case is nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. But the point here is that Brexiteers should be looking beyond, and indeed everyone should be looking beyond, to try to see what regulations the UK should put in place going forward, even after the transition, to say what country we want to create post-Brexit.
George, Nigel Farage was speaking on the show earlier on today and saying, well, this isn't the Brexit that the British public voted for, and we'll go into Europe cap in hand.
I think the problem that the Brexiteers are going to face is that throughout this process, they have assured the British public that they can have their cake and eat it, that we can leave the EU, as the public voted to do in the referendum, but that we can maintain the economic benefits of membership, all the benefits of single market and customs union membership. In phase 2 of the negotiations, that claim is going to be exposed. The EU has made it very clear today that there are 2 choices for the UK. They can adopt something like the arrangement that Norway has, where you're outside the EU, but you still respect all of its laws, all of its regulations, in order to get the market access. Or you can have something closer to the arrangement Canada has, where you have a very basic trade relationship, which allows you to make your own laws in more areas, but which you pay an economic price for. There is no third way. And the Brexiteers who've pretended all along that not only that we can maintain the benefits of the EU, but actually that we're going to reap a fiscal windfall, that we will have 350 million extra a week to spend on the NHS or whatever else we may choose. That is not possible, and that is going to become increasingly clear to voters as the talks continue.
Rory, this last phase has been so difficult, it's been so intense, it's been so fraught with complications. I mean, what can we expect for the next stage? Because if it's as complicated as what we've just seen, it's going to be a real headache.
Well, the hope is that the concentration for the next phase will be on trade, and that is the UK's key card. The UK is one of the largest economies, not just for the EU, but in terms of the world. We consume, in terms of the goods deficit, over £80 billion more than we sell. And as a result, we are in a good position to continue with these trade deals or these trade negotiations in a positive light with the strong upper hand.
So they need us more than we need them. Is that what you're saying?
Well, broadly, but I'm also saying actually the UK is a much larger country than just what the EU wants it to be. The UK is a global nation. We want to create a global Britain connecting with trade partners all around the world. And in the Brexit discussions, it shouldn't be sidelined, the concept that the UK will be reaching out beyond the European Union to our trading partners around the world.
George?
Well, I have to say the idea that the EU needs us more than we need them just isn't true. If there was to say to be no deal or a bad deal, we will be trading less with 27 countries. The EU will be trading less with only 1, and the cost of no deal would be far higher to us than it is for them. But also for political reasons, the EU have to ensure that the deal is inferior to Britain's current membership, because otherwise you're creating an incentive for other member states to leave the EU. So they have to ensure that Britain cannot maintain all of the economic benefits of EU membership. It will have to pay a price for Brexit. The deal we get will be inferior to our current membership. The only question is how bad it will be.
Rory, just before you go, we've heard cabinet ministers come out today in support of the Prime Minister. We've heard from Michael Gove, Boris Johnson. I was just talking to Dominic Raab a few moments ago, all singing from the same hymn sheet. How long do you think that can last?
Well, how long's a piece of string? I think the big success for the government in this round of agreements is the fact that Theresa May has got this agreement, and it allows cabinet ministers to go onto the media and to say Theresa May has acted in the national interest and secured this part of the deal. This is a success story, and what the cabinet are trying to do is rally behind her as a strong leader and put forward to the country this perception that Theresa's done good.
Rory, George, gentlemen, many thanks indeed for your time. Thank you. Well, staying with the deal over phase 1 of the Brexit negotiations. After talks which lasted into the small hours of this morning, Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker announced that significant progress has been made on the 3 main parts of the deal. They included the promise that there would be no hard border in Ireland. Well, let's go live now to Trowbridge in Wiltshire, where we can speak to the Conservative MP, Dr Andrew Morrison, who is chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. Many thanks indeed for joining us this afternoon. Your reflections, your reaction on the deal that's been done today?
Well, I'm really pleased. I'm relieved. I expected us to get to this point, but it's been pretty hard won. I'm particularly delighted at the accommodation we appear to be reaching with respect to the island of Ireland. Paragraph 49 in the 96-paragraph document that we've arrived at just gives an indication as to why it was so difficult to reach the accommodation that appears to have been reached this week. But it seems to me that a form of words has been reached that will please most of the parties that need to take this work forward. And we look forward very much now to that crucial phase, phase 2, the trade talks, which of course is completely wrapped up with what will happen in the island of Ireland after we leave the European Union in March 2019.
I was speaking to Dominic Raab a few moments ago, the Justice Secretary, and I was asking him about a full alignment. He seems confident that that would not happen. How confident are you? Do you have any concerns, any reservations at all?
Well, regulatory alignment, I think, is very much in the lexicography of Brexit right now. And I think it is completely central to what we will be debating over the next few months, running up to October, when we really do have to have thrashed out an agreement with the European Union in order to satisfy the various waypoints and the deadlines if we're to meet that March 2019 target. Dominic's right. Really, there's a spectrum, I think, in this. We could go for full regulatory alignment. That probably means tariffs as well. That certainly wouldn't be in the spirit of what people voted for in June last year, or somewhere between where we are now and that's, I suspect, where the debate will be. But really, there's a huge amount of work to do to try to work out precisely where on that spectrum we land up. But a realisation also among Eurosceptics that we are going to have to make an accommodation. And just as we would have to accommodate any sort of free trade arrangement, we're going to have to give a bit when it comes to regulation and tariff if we were to get this across the line.
Yeah, £39 billion is quite a lot of money to give away. That's quite a bitter pill to swallow for those backbench Brexiteer MPs.
I think that's the upper limit that I've heard bandied about, and it's over many, many years. So actually, it probably isn't quite as bad as it looks. We were always going to have to pay some sort of divorce bill, and some of the figures, particularly early on in this negotiation period, were very much higher than that. So I think spread out over time, that's probably acceptable and at the upper limit.
Is this the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end?
Well, that's semantics, but there's a lot of hard work to go, isn't there? This is going to be a long process, many late nights, I suspect. But I'm really upbeat after this week, and particularly the announcement this morning that we're on track now to secure that deep and comprehensive free trade arrangement with our European friends and neighbours that will give us the kind of future we all of us want, both in the United Kingdom, of course in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and the European Union.
Dr. Andrew Morrison, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Stage 1 is done. Next up, the beginning of talks about our future relationship with the EU, including trade. After through-the-night negotiations, a deal was struck first thing this morning between the UK and the EU on key areas, including the Irish border and the divorce bill, which Downing Street says will amount to between £35 and £39 billion. Now the UK can at last move on to the next stage of talks. But the head of the European Commission sounded a warning. So much time has been devoted to the easier part of the negotiations, he said. Now comes the hard part. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, has more.
While most of us slept, when hardly a soul was stirring, the residents of Downing Street were up. Late night calls, then at 7 minutes past 4, onto the plane. Theresa May travelling, while Jean-Claude Juncker was pacing, waiting in so many ways for the UK. And then, touchdown. Ready? Ready if you are. Taking their places for the moment, after 3 days of cajoling, compromise and criticism. It was a good morning for Theresa May. A deal to pave the way to Brexit round 2, the jargon she had longed to hear.
Sufficient progress has now been made on the strict terms of the divorce. This was a difficult negotiation for the European Union as well as for the United Kingdom.
After breakdown on Monday, blocked by her allies at home, a huge weight off the government's stressed shoulders.
I very much welcome the prospect of moving ahead to the next phase, to talk about trade and security, and to discuss the positive and ambitious future relationship.
Are you going to be celebrating, Mr Barnier?
No.
Cracking up in the champagne?
I'm still working, no.
Still more work to do?
No celebrations for either side.
No champagne?
In sort of negotiation, you have to bring water, huh?
Water?
There have been many compromises and more to come. The agreement implies it will cost between £35 and £39 billion to settle our accounts as we leave. There's no final figure, and it could be more, but paid over many years. Both sides say Brits who live elsewhere in the EU and European citizens who live here will have their rights protected. And crucially, for Tory backbenchers, the role of the European Court will be limited. There's a promise there'll be no hard border in Ireland between North and South. A vow their rules and regulations will be aligned if there's no big trade deal. And a time-limited transition period as we leave.
No, we're not making any comment.
But what about the DUP, who'd so embarrassed the Prime Minister on Monday? She needs their votes in Parliament, and this week they squeezed some concessions. But in the early hours, Theresa May made the decision to crack on, even though they weren't quite sure.
There are still matters there that we would have liked to see clarified. We ran out of time, essentially. We think that we needed to go back again and talk about those matters. But the Prime Minister has decided to go to Brussels in relation to this text, and she says she has done that in the national interest.
And the leader of the opposition, speaking at the UN today, was even less impressed.
This could have been done some time ago. The referendum took place in 2016. We're now right at the end of 2017, and this is the first time there's been any signs of any movement to go on to phase 2.
But Tory relief washed over social media, the cabinet falling over themselves to praise their boss. And notable by their absence, most Tory Brexiteers.
The ultimate arbiter. Put that in your pipe and smoke it.
The real criticism from this man. Remember him?
Amazing, isn't it? British Prime Minister has to fly through the middle of the night to go and meet some unelected bureaucrats who pat her on the head and say, you've met all of our demands, you've made sufficient progress, we can move on to the next stage. I mean, the whole thing's a humiliation.
And as one of the brokers in Brussels was only too keen to point out, reaching the next deal to shake on will be harder still.
Let us remember that the most difficult challenge is still ahead. We all know that breaking up is hard, but breaking up and building a new relation is much harder.
But round here, there's no jubilation. It's more like thank goodness, because these negotiations are intertwined with the Prime Minister's fate. The talks stumble, so does she. The talks muddle through, and so does she. And had there not been this deal at dawn, there'd have been serious rumblings about Theresa May's future. So with progress comes breathing space, but there's compromise, plenty of it. And with that comes winners and losers, and no real guarantees. Getting this far and keeping the peace has strained this street already. The Tory divisions have not disappeared, but agreeing anything has been an achievement. For tonight at least, a little goodwill. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
So what exactly was agreed in the small hours this morning between the UK and the EU? And what does it mean? Chris Morris from the BBC's Reality Check team takes a closer look.
A breakthrough in the Brexit negotiations for sure, but it's worth emphasising that this is only an agreement that sufficient progress has been made on issues relating to the UK's withdrawal. It locks in the progress made so far, but at the same time emphasises that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And the toughest talks are still to come.
This is not the end, but it is the end of the beginning. And we will remain fully engaged and vigilant throughout phase 2, the drafting and ratification of the new treaties that will be required between the EU and the UK and their implementation.
So how has the benchmark of sufficient progress been reached? Well, on the Irish border, the hope is that a future free trade agreement will mean many of the concerns about a hard border simply melt away. But as a backstop, if all else fails, the UK has promised to maintain full alignment with EU single market and customs rules that govern trade across the border. Exactly how that will be done isn't entirely clear, but you certainly can't have partial membership of the single market and the customs union. On citizens' rights, it's been agreed that the cut-off date for an agreement on the rights of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens elsewhere in the EU will be the day Brexit actually happens. In other words, some people yet to arrive could still qualify. There will also be a potential role for the European Court of Justice, directly for 8 years and indirectly thereafter. The number of legal cases it's likely to cover is very small, but some Brexiteers won't be entirely happy. Nor are some campaigners for citizens' rights, because many details have yet to be resolved. And then there's the financial settlement, the divorce bill. A method for calculating it has been agreed. It will be paid in euro. But technical negotiations will continue on various aspects, including when and how the money gets paid. How much is the final amount likely to be? We'll probably never know for sure. But UK sources say the equivalent of up to £40 billion, while some EU sources still think it will be higher. And this is only phase one. Formal talks about the outlines of a future relationship on trade, security and so on haven't yet started. The next priority will be to agree upon the terms of a transition period for about 2 years after Brexit. It is very clear that more challenging negotiation lies ahead. Chris Morris, BBC News.
Well, in a moment we'll get the thoughts of our political editor Laura Koonsberg. But first, our correspondent Adam Fleming is in Brussels. And Adam, what more can you tell us about the reaction there in Brussels and among European leaders?
Hi Fiona, what a difference has been made by Mrs May's pre-dawn dash here to Brussels this morning. The atmosphere here feels quite different tonight as it starts snowing. Just listen to Jean-Claude Juncker saying that today marked a personal triumph for Theresa May. Officials saying that means that now that the slightly bad-tempered divorce talks are out the way, the talks about the future partnership between the EU and the UK might happen in a much more constructive, more friendly, affable atmosphere. The first order of business, as we were just hearing, will be discussions about a transition and implementation phase where things will broadly stay the same. Those discussions will start in the new year, although the discussions about the shape of a future partnership on trade, security, defence, climate change, you name it, they will not begin until the spring at the earliest. And the EU is really desperate for the British cabinet to sit around the table and make some big decisions about the definition of that future relationship. What does Britain really want is the refrain you hear a lot here. And some officials have been slightly worried by what they've seen this week. They think the debate about the issues about Northern Ireland and divergence, convergence or alignment spell the fact that the big discussion about Britain's future might be quite difficult and perhaps quite bad-tempered in the UK.
Okay, Adam in Brussels, thank you. And Laura at Westminster, Theresa May looking significantly happier today than she did at the start of the week. This must be a huge relief to her.
Oh, I think it is, Fiona. There's no question about that. And I think for me there are three big things really about today. The first, as you suggest, this is the first big piece of good news that Theresa May has had really for quite some time now. You know, the Prime Minister and the government have had a very, very rocky few months. Brexit is the biggest thing that they've got to deal with, and it was looking extremely fraught. And she had real personal embarrassment when the talks were blocked by her small party of allies here in the UK. So this is a good day, and the government is very, very relieved. The second thing, though, is there is probably inevitably an awful lot of fudge in this agreement. There are probably more compromises in there than there are the number of pages, which is 15. And those big clashes between the EU and the UK and the big clashes inside the Tory party have been delayed rather than resolved. Yes, there are some things that have been agreed or promises that have been made, but they're more the nature of sort of, well, we agree this is a problem and we'll find a solution together when it gets to the really thorny questions. So nothing about the next phase is going to be easy. And the third thing to bear in mind is, while this is a big moment, there's no question about that in the whole Brexit process, it is true, to use the cliche, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That means that although both sides have made these vows to each other, they've made these complicated set of promises, it is still possible that if the next phase of the deal all goes sour, that none of this might come to pass. So the government and the EU have come a long way. They have started to rebuild some of that trust that has gone so awry in recent weeks. But this is absolutely not the end. It's like we've climbed the first hill in a whole range of pretty scary looking mountains.
Laura in Westminster and Adam Fleming in Brussels, thank you both.
So it appears that everyone's a winner after phase one of Brexit talks, but can that be real? The last-minute deal agreed with the EU means both sides can move on to the next stage, having agreed there would be no hard border with Ireland, protected rights for EU citizens here and UK citizens in Europe, and a divorce bill of up to £40 billion. The European Commission President called it a breakthrough and a personal success for Theresa May. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
4 in the morning at RAF Northolt, the Prime Minister boards the plane to Brussels, sweeping into town to shake on a divorce deal. In from the cold and operating on 2 hours sleep, Theresa May got a deal that pushed back the EU on some of their demands, but overall is much closer to their plan than hers. 4 days after the DUP forced Theresa May to abandon her trip here on Monday, the Prime Minister said she was back with a better deal.
We've been working extremely hard this week, and as you've all seen, it hasn't been easy for either side. When we met on Monday, we said a deal was within reach. What we have arrived at today represents a significant improvement.
Monday's dash back to London, to many in Brussels, was just the latest evidence of Theresa May's political instability at home.
Prime Minister May has assured me that it has the backing of the UK government. On that basis, I believe we have now made the breakthrough we needed.
After they left the stage, the government chief whip tweeted a photo of Boris Johnson talking to Theresa May yesterday, presumably intended to reassure some who, like Mr Johnson himself, have mocked the idea of paying up big EU demands.
Extortionate, and I think to go whistle is an entirely appropriate expression.
The agreement comes up with an ingenious solution to the divorce bill problem. Theresa May was told she couldn't get support within her party unless she kept the bill under £40 billion. The government's come up with a series of commitments which it says do come to just under £40 billion. It's even got the EU to sign off on that as a reasonable estimate. Truth is, we won't really know what these liabilities come to until years to come. And privately, many in Brussels think the total could be 20% higher. The DUP extracted extra pledges from the government that Northern Ireland would not be joined to Ireland by EU rules, putting up barriers with Britain. The DUP leader said her party wanted more, but Theresa May had insisted it was time to cut a deal.
We ran out of time, essentially. We think that we needed to go back again and talk about those matters, but the Prime Minister has decided to go to Brussels in relation to this text, and she says she has done that in the national interest.
The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, tweeted of the hurdles still to come if the 27 countries staying in the EU sign off on this deal. Talks could then move to a transition. The European Council President Donald Tusk spelling out today what that could mean for the UK.
Naturally, we have our conditions. I propose that during this period, the UK will respect the whole of EU law, including new law. It will respect budgetary commitments.
Donald Tusk, saying he had important business out of Brussels today, contributed to the pressure for Theresa May to work through the night. His immovable appointment, it turns out, an honorary doctorate in Hungary. Giving a speech in Geneva, Jeremy Corbyn denounced the time wasted by the government in these talks.
This could have been done some time ago. The referendum took place in 2016. We're now right at the end of 2017, and this is the first time there's been any signs of any movement to go on to phase 2 of the negotiations.
Months of work produced this 15-page agreement. and that's about 1% of the size of an average EU trade agreement, giving you some idea of the workload ahead. A Cabinet committee on Monday afternoon will, for the first time it's expected, discuss Britain's future post-Brexit relationship with Europe. And many in the EU openly wonder whether Theresa May's government will be able to withstand the strain and division that will bring. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Justice Minister, Dominic Raab, a leading Brexiteer at the referendum, and I put to him that some in favour of a hard Brexit, like Nigel Farage, are calling this deal a capitulation and a humiliation, caving in on the key points.
I love the fact that Channel 4 is quoting Nigel Farage and UKIP. They're, of course, struggling for relevance precisely because we're giving effect to the referendum.
But are they right?
And we're making a success of these negotiations. No, they're not. We're a third of the way through a 2-year negotiation period. We've today settled the issue of EU nationals here and the 1 million UK expats abroad. We've opened the door to trade talks, very important for business confidence. And we've narrowed down the areas of disagreement and paved the way for the agreement on the thorny issues like the financial settlement and Northern Ireland.
How often during the referendum campaign did you tell people that the European Court of Justice would still be ruling over British decisions for 10 years after people had voted?
Well, first of all, that's wrong in terms of the reflection of the what's been agreed today.
What's wrong about it?
I'll explain. We're taking back control over our laws, and the UK Supreme Court will have the last word on the laws of the land. There is no question of anyone being able to sue the UK in the European Court of Justice, whether it's an EU national, the European Commission, or an EU member state.
No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. The quote says,
you're trying to mislead
where
your viewers.
judges consider a European court ruling on the question is necessary. So British judges may acknowledge that a European court ruling is necessary for another 10 years. How often did you tell people that?
No, sorry, you're totally willfully skewing what the reality is. Let me explain it to you, and then your viewers get a fair account. What we've said is in relation to EU nationals, and there are reciprocal arrangements for UK expats abroad, we will reflect the rights in UK law. UK courts will decide it. If the Supreme Court, for a limited period of 8 years, not 10, so that limited period will be able to refer a point of interpretation to the ECJ. And the reason that's important, and we should do that, is because it makes sure that UK expats have their rights protected in the same way and on a level playing field with EU nationals here.
When does this 8 years in which UK courts will ask for European rulings begin?
Well, it would be from the point of exit, I'm assuming. I'd need to check that, but it's from the point of exit.
So that's March 2019? Yeah, that's more than 10 years after people voted, isn't it? That's why I said 10 years,
not
8.
Well, it's like you're really trying to
just
exaggerate.
tell people the facts.
No, come on. You're having me on. The point I'm making is it's 8 years from the point of exit. That's what's in the joint agreement today.
Why have you agreed to full alignment with those rules of the internal market and the customs union?
We haven't. So again, willfully
That's what it says in the text.
No, what it says in the text is if we don't agree any of the other models, in relation to Northern Ireland and the Southern cooperation with the Republic of Ireland, there would be alignment. And what that means is that on some of the issues, for example, of borders or customs, you would agree the ends, but what full alignment means is you agree the ends, but you have control over the means to deliver it.
So all our regulations would have to be aligned with EU regulations. That's what you're saying, isn't it?
No, it's the opposite.
That's what full alignment means.
No, it doesn't. You're just wrong.
So which regulations could we drop?
First of all, it's only in relation to the North-South, the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Second of all, alignment, what full alignment means is alignment of the regulatory objectives, but it leaves you discretion and room for manoeuvre on the means to achieve that.
Yeah. Which rules and regulations only apply to Northern Ireland and don't apply to the rest of the United Kingdom? What proportion of them?
Well, I don't know off the top of my head, but the point is all of the detail of this will be ironed out. I think in the area of Northern Ireland, what you've got there is the contours of some principles that have been agreed to guide us in the future. But it's certainly fair to say that there's still a lot of detail to be ironed out in relation to Northern Ireland.
Now, if we are fully aligned to EU rules, can we be free to negotiate free trade deals with other countries? For example, if we wanted to do a free trade deal with America, where they have their chlorine-washed chicken, how could we do that free trade deal when the European rules that we would have to be fully aligned with, according to your commitment, prohibit that.
Let me reiterate again, the Prime Minister has been crystal clear, and we're coming out of the customs union and the single market precisely in order that we can strike free trade deals with other countries around the world. But equally, free trade, energetic free trade, doesn't mean we dilute all of our standards here in the UK, that we could turn Britain into some bargain basement. We're not saying that. Free trade is about the win-win of free trade. It's good for business, it's good for jobs, it's good for productivity.
Right. Do you think, going back over what you said before the referendum, if instead of a bus promising £350 million for the NHS every week, you'd said it's going to cost £35 to £39 billion, the European Court will still be making rulings for 10 years after you've voted, we will have full alignment with European rules where it comes to the single market and the currency union, people would still have voted the way they did?
What you just said is a load of nonsense, so it's totally irrelevant.
Well, it's
nice
all out
try.
of your document, so if it's nonsense, it's your document.
No, it's your willful skewing of what we've agreed today and your willful inability to accept that we've actually made a really positive step forward for the whole country. But nice try.
Dominic Raab. So was the deal announced today really what Brexit supporters were anticipating? Our Europe editor Matt Fry has been to Didcot, once described as the most normal town in England, to find out what the people there, exceptional I'm sure, think of the £35 to £39 billion divorce bill, full alignment with EU rules and rights for European citizens.
This is how the vast majority of us get to see Didcot. But you ignore this place at your peril. Recently, it was scientifically proven to be the most normal town in the UK. If you distill all the complex politics of post-referendum Britain into one location, Didcot is what you get. Lucky for us then that we bumped into its MP on the train up.
So if you look at education, life expectancy, occupations, Didcot sits squarely in middle Britain. And I think it did vote 52-48 to leave, so the majority of Didcotians want to leave the European Union.
But we braved a mini flash blizzard to talk to voters, not politicians, and the news of today's deal had yet to filter through. A deal that was done this morning about Brexit. Did you hear about this?
No, I haven't heard.
We're going to have to pay them, I think, £40 billion, and EU citizens are free to stay.
Oh, that's good. We like that.
You like that? With all the rights that they've enjoyed so far.
Yes,
they can bring in their relatives, their closest relatives.
But a lot of this stuff comes from Europe now.
Right, like what?
Well, the strawberries,
blueberries,
and raspberries.
These are all European.
If the deal was good, the stock market would have gone up.
Yeah.
If the deal's bad, it would have gone down.
So what would you like to have seen instead of what we've got today?
A complete block on it.
Really?
Yeah.
And what about the people already here?
If they've been here and born here and been here for years, I've no objections.
What about the 40 billion to the EU as a divorce settlement?
I think that sucks. You know, why?
How much should we be paying?
We shouldn't be paying nothing.
Have you heard the news about the deal this morning?
Yeah, about the Brexit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard for that. And for me, it doesn't matter. You know, I'm here from 2014. Yeah. But it's not bad. It's not good for the other people, you know, who coming in now.
My first reaction was most people won't understand any of that because the attitude is that, oh, something's done, let's get on with it. My view is completely different because I'm concerned about 40 billion. I'm concerned about the trade deal. And as for the Irish situation, if that satisfies the Irish on both sides of the border, I'm happy.
So the deal remains in the very subjective eye of the beholder, a victory for constructive ambiguity. How very normal.
Well, the deal worked out by the politicians has got us finally to Brexit Phase 2, transition and then the trade talks, though Brussels officials say they're not likely to start anytime soon. Given the complexities and anxieties of Phase 1, how are they likely to go? Our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is here. What can we look forward to?
Well, Donald Tusk ironically described today's agreement, which has taken 18 months to get to, as the easiest part of negotiations. So I think we can brace ourselves for some significant hurdles. First and foremost is the agreement of objective guidelines. Now, Britain wanted these guidelines to describe the hopes of EU countries after Brexit. And today we got this two-page document. But now the EU wants more information from us in order to provide this longer final document. But we're not going to get that for months, Krish. And until we get that, we're not really going to have trade talks.
And so the sequence is what? Transition talks first?
Well, I'm afraid that's another ticking time bomb and the second kind of hurdle that we're going to face. Because whether we have a final Norwegian-style deal, Canadian-style deal or bespoke deal, it's going to take more than 12 months to agree. And so that's why the transition deal is so important. The Chancellor said 2 years. Most people think more like 5 years. And according to this document, in that period, almost everything stays the same. And for companies, for manufacturers, for the city, that's incredibly important. They want to see a transitional deal before March next year so that they don't have to start planning for this cliff edge scenario where they have to move offices, pull staff, yank UK investment.
But if you get through those two hurdles, then it's a clean home straight, nice, gentle Brexit.
Oh, well, of course, nothing's straight in Brexit, because if you get through both of those, the third hurdle is going to be the actual legal framework that underpins the withdrawal agreement. Now, we got a flavour of that by today's report, which came from Brussels and from Number 10, but that has to be translated into a legal document. And a lot of those subjects, as you were talking about earlier, are really controversial. The extended power of the European Court of Justice, the citizens' rights. You know, all of those subjects could derail further negotiations, either here in the UK or within Europe.
Thanks, Helia. Well, I'm joined now from Loughborough by Nicky Morgan, Conservative Chair of the Treasury Select Committee and an advocate of a soft Brexit, having been a Remainer, and from West London, the Labour MP, Chuka Umunna, who is a supporter of Open Britain, a group campaigning to keep the UK in the single market. Chuka Umunna, everyone said it couldn't be done. She's done it, you know, and she's got through to, you know, the trade talks where everything can get put on the table. You should be congratulating her, surely.
Well, I'm not sure congratulations are the word, but I'm very pleased that we've been able to reach agreement on the three key things, the divorce bill, EU citizens and the Irish border. Well, in terms, I mean, the Irish border hasn't been completely sorted, but I'm glad sufficient agreement's been reached so that we can move to the next phase. But Christian, don't forget, this has involved a radical rewriting of the red lines that the Prime Minister set out in January. She said, under no circumstances would we be in a situation where we were abiding by the rules of the single market and the customs union. Personally, I think that's a good thing. I think we should stay in the single market and the customs union. But the backstop position that the UK government has agreed to today is that if that is necessary to resolve the Irish border issue, then alignment, as it's now being called, will be accepted. The other thing, of course, was we were told we wouldn't abide by the judgments of the European Court of Justice. That's going to happen on EU citizens, and we were told there wouldn't be a big divorce bill to pay, or that she wouldn't agree to that. She's agreed to that, and she's had to do this to move forward. Now, just think about the amount of time that's been wasted between now and then, and we're more than halfway through this process, and we've still got a hell of a lot more to agree on.
Nicky Morgan, I mean, are you clear what this question of full alignment means? Because when I put this to Dominic Raab, because lots of people are very excited about this statement of full alignment with the single market and the currency union, because they think that means a hard Brexit's now impossible. He was really saying I'd got it all wrong and I'd misunderstood, and full alignment doesn't mean that we are tied to every single EU rule. What's your understanding of it?
Well, my understanding is that actually we're not going to get to the bottom of this completely until the trade agreement is finally signed and it's on the table and ready for the parties to move on. And it's always been, I think, in my opinion, the case that it was going to be impossible to completely resolve the Irish border at this stage of the talks until we got into the trade talks. And I think that's what's happened. I mean, there's undoubtedly already, there are rules and systems which apply, as I understand it, both in Northern Ireland and also in the Republic of Ireland. And they're certainly aligned, and I would expect that to continue. There might be specific sectors like agriculture, for example. But I think the important principle agreed today is that the whole of the UK is going to be treated as one in terms of the rules that eventually will apply. But, you know, this is a significant step that Theresa May has got us to, and the EU have moved as well. To move on to phase 2 at this stage was really, really important, and I'm very pleased that the Prime Minister insisted on keeping talking and negotiating throughout this week.
But Nicky Morgan, it's very confusing because you, as a Remainer who now wants a soft Brexit, is very happy, and, you know, really full-on Brexiteers who'd be relatively happy with a hard Brexit are also very happy. One side has got to be under a misunderstanding here, surely. I mean, you can't both be getting it right.
I don't think so, actually. Well, in politics, you're right. If both sides are getting it right, then normally, you know, I knew as education secretary I was probably in the wrong place. But I think on this, to be honest with you, I think the negotiations have been clearly very difficult, and you know, huge amount of hard work and determination has been shown by Number 10. And I think that, you know, this is phase 1. I mean, the point is, as we heard today, you know, we're only moving into phase 2 now. Those are going to be pretty tough negotiations as well. But I think it's good. I think that, you know, Dom Raab, I just came in at the end of his remarks. You know, Michael Gove speaking this morning. There are people on My View, actually, who I think there is a sense of, and I think actually out in the streets, I heard your interview with some people from Didcot, and I'd say that would be the same actually in Loughborough, which would be actually relief that we are going to move on and we're going to have trade talks, hopefully a trade deal that is going to be good for our economy, that's going to support jobs, and that's what this is all about at the end of the day. There is no point undermining our economy just to leave.
What do you think, Chukramunna, of this fact that both, you know, hard Brexiteers and soft Brexiteers are happy today? I mean, somebody's got to be confused here.
Well, the fact is, if Theresa May had listened to people like Nicky, all this time wouldn't have been wasted. Nicky's adopted a much more flexible, less ideological position on this, putting people's jobs first. And if she'd listened to people like Nicky in the Conservative Party, the national interest would have been taken forward. But I think the real, and frankly, let's be clear where Dominic Raab and the Brexiteers are coming from. They just want us out at all costs on the 29th of March 2019, regardless of how much agreement has been reached on our future relationship. I think the key thing here, though, is what we are seeing as this process goes along are new facts emerging almost every week that nobody really knew about when we were having the hypothetical discussion during the EU referendum campaign as to what would happen. So that big divorce bill, possibly over 40 billion. Nobody thought that was going to happen. Of course, now that's going to happen. You're certainly not going to see £350 million extra per week going to the NHS. The very fact, actually, Krishnan, that this has impacted on the Irish border wasn't something that people thought of. When John Major and Tony Blair, I remember you covering, actually, on Channel 4 News their visit to Northern Ireland during the referendum campaign, and people were saying, oh, all this talk about how it's going to affect the peace process, etc., is Project Fear. It's dominated everything over the last few days. It could have held up this whole process. So every week new facts are emerging, and that's why I think Britain, we need to have an open mind as to what happens at the end of this process, because the bottom line is Brexit, in the terms that it was sold to your viewers, is simply proving to be undeliverable. It's not just a competence issue with the government, it's the fact that Brexit, in the terms that you bought it, is not achievable at the moment.
Do you agree with that, Nicky Morgan?
Well, I think there are always going to be compromises and trade-offs. You know, in leaving the European Union, we've been part of it for 40 years. We have obviously very clear convergence. You know, our rules are the same, which enables us obviously to trade in the single market and be members of the customs union, and obviously in financial services, which is something that the Treasury Select Committee looks at a great deal. That's a huge strength. That has made the City of London important worldwide and able, I should say, to pay £72 billion of taxes towards our public services last year. So I think actually what we've seen in the last week or so is that reality has really set in. I still think we are going to be leaving the European Union in March 2019, but we are going to do it in a way that is not going to undermine our economy, and the government has shown that it's prepared to be flexible, as has the European Union, to get us to the right place at the end of this.
Sorry to cut in, but thank you both very much for joining us, Nicky Morgan and Chukramunna. I'm joined now from Westminster by our political editor, Gary Gibbon. Where does this leave us?
I think you have to imagine what it would be like tonight if there was no sign of agreement, if this whole thing over the divorce bill had been falling apart. In those circumstances, I think you would have seen possibly an unstoppable call for Britain to walk away from the talks amongst Conservative MPs. You could easily have imagined all of these things contributing to the toppling of Theresa May. Neither of those things are totally remote possibilities still, and won't be into 2018, but they are tonight reduced possibilities. Where are we going now? We go to the transition. That will be a very bitter pill for a lot of Tories to swallow, and to trade talks. We know the government, the cabinet, is bitterly divided over whether Britain should, after Brexit, hug Europe close or start afresh, have a more distant relationship. The discussion in cabinet has been pushed off again and again by Theresa May because she fears the bloodshed that could follow. Cabinet will actually start discussing this the week after next, and on Monday, this coming Monday, it's expected a Cabinet committee will start discussing it. And I think the overall feeling as they approach all of this is a bit of relief about today, no excitement about that, real trepidation about the discussions to come.
Thanks, Gary.
If the government wanted to inject some drama and excitement into the Brexit story, which some might argue is badly needed, then they certainly managed it, with Theresa May making a pre-dawn flight from RAF Northolt across the Channel this morning with the latest version of the UK position. It would only have been better if she'd actually piloted the plane herself. But as to the actual substance, a deal on EU citizens' rights, a divorce settlement of 35 to 40 billion euros, a date for the end of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and a bit of finagling over Northern Ireland, but the actual promise there would not be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Enough to get phase one of the negotiations over the line, and assuming it gets the nod from the European Council next week, to start talks about a trade agreement rested and refreshed. Here's our political editor, Nick Watt.
Comma, comma, down, doobie-doo, down, down. Comma, comma, down, doobie-doo, down, down. Breaking up is hard to do.
When everyone else is having fun, breaking up can be so hard, as Theresa May discovered at an EU summit last year. Or maybe we do have friends after all. At the end of a week of heartache, Theresa May finally pulled off a deal with the EU on stage one of the Brexit negotiations.
Sufficient progress has now been made on the strict terms of the divorce.
I very much welcome the prospect of moving ahead to the next phase, to talk about trade and security, and to discuss the positive and ambitious future relationship.
But after Monday's humiliation, how did it happen?
Shortly after 11 p.m. in Downing Street last night, Theresa May finally achieved the breakthrough when she sort of won over the DUP in a telephone call with Arlene Foster. At around midnight, she left Downing Street, skipping the office Christmas party to catch 2 hours sleep at her constituency home in Maidenhead. Then at 3:45 a.m, she was picked up for an RAF flight to Brussels.
The deal covered the three main separation areas. Theresa May has resisted pressure to keep Northern Ireland in the EU's single market and customs union. But the EU has secured an alignment of rules in areas related to cross-border cooperation in the event of no deal. The UK cut an initial EU demand for a Brexit payment of up to £65 billion by around a half, but the UK will still pay between £36 and £39 billion. The European Court of Justice will have a limited role overseeing the rights of EU citizens in the UK for 8 years rather than 15. But EU citizens lawfully resident in the UK on Brexit Day will have their rights guaranteed. We've heard a lot about a Tory civil war on Europe. Well, today, the tribe appeared to embrace the spirit of Christmas goodwill.
This agreement is a significant political achievement for the Prime Minister.
Theresa May has absolutely put her mark on this. She has stood up and she has not been found to be wanting at all.
Others weren't quite buying into the accord.
I listened to Michael Gove and Boris Johnson today and thought, were we on the same side? I simply couldn't believe it. I'll say this to you. I think within the next 48 hours, you will hear a lot more Conservative voices who perhaps kept quiet this morning, saying actually they're not happy with what's happened today.
At the heart of this deal lies a cabinet truce on Brexit. The Leave side are so concerned to preserve their actual goal of leaving that they're willing to give ground on the details. The Remain side have accepted the UK is leaving, but they've been pushing for a gentle Brexit. The Prime Minister's challenge is to preserve that truce going into the next round of negotiations.
One minister who supported Remain hopes the UK will hug the EU close.
this talk of ongoing alignment, I think there will be some key strategic sectors, and I look at it as financial services as the member for the city, but I think it applies to professional services, biotech, life sciences, a number of sectors like that where actually a fragmentation of the European offering in global terms would be bad news, not just for us, but for the EU 27. And I think in those sorts of areas, I suspect that in the years to come we will want to mirror many of the regulations and directives that come out of Europe. But in the overwhelming bits of the economy, both in goods and services, I think we then want to move ahead positively on with a free trade deal as quickly as possible.
Labour believes this has been a less than glorious week for the government.
Look, Theresa May should have hit the first deadline in October. She failed. She looks as if she's going to hit this deadline. That is progress, and it'd be churlish of me not to recognise it as progress. But what we can't have going forward is the absolutely chaotic scenes that we've seen this week.
But in Whitehall they are likening the deal to Churchill and El Alamein. The word is, it is the end of the beginning.
Well, Nick is with me now. So then, what's the mood in Downing Street tonight?
Well, there's absolute delight, but it's interestingly, talking to officials, I don't get the impression that they're sort of dancing and high-fiving each other. It's more sort of stunned relief. We've done it, and this Prime Minister has at last achieved a success. But interestingly, when the Prime Minister left for Brussels, she did not know how this was going to go down politically with her backbenchers, or indeed with the DUP, because Arlene Foster, of course, had not wholly signed up to this. But talking to some of the Brexiteers who've been very, very critical of this deal this week, they've told me this evening they are not planning to rock the boat on this one, but they do have what are described as residual anxieties in two areas. One, this very limited circumstances in which the Supreme Court will refer to the European Court of Justice over European citizens, and the other one, this regulatory alignment related to Northern Ireland.
Yes, whatever that actually proves to be. What happens now then? 'Cause next is the Council of Europe.
Well, our very, very energetic Adam Fleming in Brussels, he has got a leak of the draft conclusions for the European Council meeting in Brussels on Thursday and Friday. Good news and bad news. The good news is that the European Council is suggesting yes to a transition deal for 2 years. The bad news is that the entire body of EU law would apply to the UK in that period, and any new laws and regulations introduced in that period would apply to the UK, which would have no votes. That crosses one of Boris Johnson's red lines, which maybe explains why the Chief Whip sent out a photo of him today meeting the Prime Minister in the early hours, because the Prime Minister will be having a cabinet meeting and discussion before Christmas on the future.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. Well, Government Minister today were so pleased with the outcome and the lack of incoming so far from the right of the party, it was as if Christmas had come early. Certainly the Justice Minister, Dominic Raab, was in a chipper mood when I spoke to him earlier at Westminster. I asked him whether today's deal was proof the government had caved in to EU demands.
We're a third of the way through a 2-year negotiation period, and today was a really important step forward on EU nationals and their rights here, on UK expats. We've opened the door to trade talks, very important for business confidence. We've narrowed the bones of contention, but not settled all the issues on Northern Ireland and money. So yes, there's
any of the issues in Northern Ireland, except there'll be no hard border.
Well, very important issue to settle. But you're right, there's going to be some hard yards left. We've got to get down to brass tacks. But we're only a third of the way through the negotiations. And as a result of taking this step, we've opened up the negotiations to talk about that future partnership deal. And the win-win of that deal on trade, on security cooperation, all those other things, is within sight. So I think it vindicates the Prime Minister's approach.
Full alignment is essentially part of the single market, beside the single market, beside customs union, on these issues: agriculture, education, transport, environment, waterways, social security, tourism, inland fisheries, health, urban and rural development. You have no power on these going forward. You will be rule takers, not rule makers. The EU will keep you in line on all these things.
Kirsty, you can't have it both ways. You can't say we've done nothing on Northern Ireland and then say we've given the game away. The reality is, what we've said today on alignment is the default position. If none of the options are agreed, but we still want and have a package within sight, is that we'd have alignment. And what alignment means is on the principles, the goals, the policy goals. For example, if it was on a certain area like I don't know, agricultural standards, but you retain the regulatory means to delivering them at home.
Let's just take agriculture, and there will be a European law on the movement of animals that you will have to adhere to if there is full alignment. Indeed, if there are new laws designed by the 27 on the movement of animals, you will have to adhere to them on full alignment.
No, you're wrong on both counts. This is the default position on those areas of North-South cooperation in the context of Northern Ireland, if nothing else can be agreed, but we want to proceed with the whole package. The detail, the options have still to be chosen. This is all still a matter for negotiations. You can call it strategic ambiguity, you can call it constructive ambiguity.
You can call it, that's very interesting, you're calling it strategic ambiguity.
What I'm admitting to you, very openly and honestly, is that we've agreed principles, but the detail still needs to be ironed out on this very bespoke set of issues around Northern Ireland, which can't be dealt with properly and responsibly outside of the context of the broader negotiation on customs and trade and all those other things which we've said all along.
If you don't get an acceptable deal on Northern Ireland, full alignment could continue forever.
Well, Kirsty, if ifs and buts were pots and pans, what I can tell you now is that we've got what we wanted, which was to move forward to talking about trade talks. We've settled the issue of EU nationals and UK nationals, and you know, we're going to open up to those trade talks, which we said should have happened at the beginning.
Nicola Sturgeon said in a tweet today that the UK government promising that there'd be no hard border in Northern Ireland means that the government can never again say that an independent Scotland would mean a hard border. She's right, isn't she?
No, she's not, but I would of course expect the SNP to view anything within their prism of their obsession with independence. I'm sure that's not the way the Scottish people think of it.
One last try on full alignment.
Go for it.
You're in the transition period, you don't have a deal in Northern Ireland, and the EU proposes a new law on agriculture you don't like. You have to adhere to the principle of it.
No, we don't. Sorry, that is not what we've agreed today. What we've agreed as a default position, I can go over it again if you like, is that if nothing else is agreed, and we're confident that we can, then actually what we would have is some form of alignment, which means you agree the policy goals.
Full alignment's not some form of alignment.
The alignment is in relation to the goals, you retain the regulatory means of achieving them.
We're now entering phase 2, and in phase 2, the draft EU Council guidelines say that in phase 2, what will be decided is that during the transition period, there will be the 4 freedoms guaranteed, and Britain will still be in the single market and the customs union. Theresa May on the 9th of October said that on March 2019, when we enter transition, the 4 freedoms will end, and we will not be in the single market and we will not be in the customs union. These are diametrically opposed statements.
That's the EU's negotiation position for phase 2.
Yeah, well, that's going to be a very big row.
It is, but we've always said let's get on and talk about trade and the transition. We can't talk about the transition till we're in those trade talks, and I'm delighted that the EU is now restless to get on and talk about that too. But of course, as you've just pointed out, there's going to be some creases that will need ironing out. We're only a third of the way through this negotiation, but at least recognise, come on Kirsty,
no, it's a major
against all the pessimism, we've made a really important step forward.
It's a major crease.
Go on, give us that.
Theresa May did not say on the 9th of October, on March 2019, I kind of hope that I'll be in a position when I enter the transition that actually I might be able to end the 4 freedoms, and I might be able to get the single market, and I might be able to get the customs union. She said on the 9th of October, these things will happen. These are not entirely in her gift.
Oh no, well, so first of all, you started by saying the EU communication was what we've agreed for the transition. It isn't, it's their position. But you're absolutely right. It's not entirely within our gift what we negotiate in phase 2. We're not there yet. I wouldn't want to get the tambourine out quite yet, Kirsty. But we're a third of the way through the negotiations, and today was a step forward and a vindication of the approach the PM's taken.
Dominic Raab.
So there's a lot of Brexit about. Let's talk about it with Susie Boniface and Dan Hodges. And the vast majority of newspapers there getting their verdict on that agreement reached in Brussels this morning, early doors. Let's start off with The Guardian, shall we? That's what the paper you've picked out first of all. Deal is done, but the EU warns of more delays because this agreement is really just to get on to the next stage, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a way of kicking the can past the current issue of Northern Ireland. It hasn't resolved the Northern Ireland border at all. There is still that huge thing to try to consider, find a way around having a land border with a super state that we don't want to have a border with anymore. But what the next stage is that next week Theresa May has to get her cabinet together, and the EU is going to say to them, look, before you can move on to talking about trade, we have to know where you want to be. We have to know what you envisage the end point of this is. And that means that Britain has to say what their aim is. And we haven't done that yet. We haven't said what we would like. We haven't talked about what we envisage the final result being. And she's got to get this agreement from Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Philip Hammond, Amber Rudd, people who are diametrically and ideologically at different ends of the idea of what Brexit could possibly be. And she has to get them to agree, and she's got to do it next week. So that's another huge... This is just the first of many fudges and negotiations she's had to do. She's got a lot more to go yet.
It is, and you know, it's obviously going to be a challenge for her to get the cabinet into one place. But then at the start of the week, we were all saying it would be next to impossible for her to get the Irish issue resolved satisfactorily and move on to the next stage of talks. And she's done that. And I think, you know, we've seen, you know, you've just seen the mix of the front pages. But the reality is, this is the first time, pretty much since she became Prime Minister, that Theresa May has had such a positive set of front pages, and there's absolutely no doubt that her personal authority has been enhanced. And so when she goes into those discussions, tense though they will be with her cabinet colleagues, she does so for the first time in a long time from a position of relative strength.
Well, yes, and let's look at one of those front pages. There's the Mail's take on it, perhaps one of the most positive of the front pages. Rejoice, we're on our way, they say. And this obviously a strongly Leave campaigning newspaper. So are you surprised, or what do you make of that front page, given that stance that they have?
Well, I think it's a reflection of how Theresa May has managed to sort of thread the eye of the needle on this issue. I mean, obviously, Daily Mail, very much a sort of pro-Brexit newspaper, cheering her, as we can see, saying on the way. If you look at the other headlines, there is a perception amongst some of the other newspapers, a perception I agree with, that actually the deal she's struck at actually is moving us towards somewhat softer Brexit than some of the hardcore Brexiteers had been anticipating. And, you know, the balance there is quite remarkable. And why do you think that, just to stop you,
why are there headlines like Mrs Softy there suggesting that Theresa May is heading towards a soft Brexit, and the I as well?
This is not what was written on the side of the tin. The Daily Mail there is rejoicing about something which, had it been offered on day one after the Brexit referendum as this is the kind of Brexit we could have, we'll still have a soft border in Ireland, we'll still have some alignment with the EU regulations, we won't be able to influence things in Europe, we will still be paying in to access the single market or to access industry regulators, and this time we won't have the rebates, it'll turn out to be more expensive, I mean, there won't be any more money for the NHS. It's the kind of thing that the Daily Mail and the Brexit campaigners would have lost their minds over not long ago. They have had to move step by step by step, and the fact they can now say rejoice, and the Express as well say, oh, we're on our way, everything's marvellous. It's like someone insisting that everything is perfectly fine when they're stuck in that car on their way home on the way to Christmas, and they're not going anywhere, you know, being in a jam and insisting we're almost there, it's not far now, children, come on, we're nearly there. It's rubbish. They're in denial. They're going through the 7 stages of grief, and they just haven't got to, they've been through shock and bargaining and anger, and they're now in denial at the moment, and they've got to move through depression and finally accepting the fact that you cannot Brexit. It's not logically possible for the entire United Kingdom to leave the EU because Northern Ireland has to remain.
We have seen Boris Johnson on Twitter welcoming or praising Theresa May for reaching the deal. There's Michael Gove as well, writing in the Telegraph there. I'll just bring it down so you can see it's the Telegraph. And also complimentary about the deal. And given that there are other headlines suggesting that this means we're heading towards a soft Brexit, is that surprising?
Well, no, I mean, I think actually one of the things I think you have to be honest about is since the election, the Brexiteers have actually been relatively restrained as the negotiations have come forward. I mean, the narrative that we all embraced was one in which Theresa May was a prisoner of the hardcore headbangers, Brexit headbangers in her party, and they were going to drive her towards this hard Brexit. And it's not actually panning out that way. And I mean, to an extent, Susie's right. I mean, we have actually seen certainly a sort of a nuancing, I'll put it that way, of some of the harder rhetoric.
Sandpapering, I think, is
from the Brexit. Well, yeah. I mean, but I think the key thing that you're seeing is, and I think this is actually what is reflected in the Mail front page. I mean, they just want Brexit. You know, they see this as the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get us out of the European Union. And if it takes a little bit longer, and if it's a little bit more complicated, and if a few deals have to be stuck on the way, yeah, and if you have to pay, you know, an exit, you know, a divorce bill that's a little bit higher than maybe some people will wanted. Well, at the moment, their attitude is, well, this is a price worth paying for us to get out.
Yeah, I mean, the Mail's got an inside piece saying this £40 billion bill looks eye-watering, but actually it's less than the amount that taxpayers stumped up to rescue RBS. It's £2 billion less than the money we would pay for staying in for 3 different years. They're trying to find ways to say they're absolutely fine with a thing that not 5 minutes ago they would have been spitting feathers about. And it's not just the Daily Mail, because the Daily Mail is very good at reflecting, as all newspapers are, reflecting their readership. There are people who voted leave up and down the country who are wondering why they're not getting what they were promised. And Leave or Remain, no one is getting the Brexit they were expecting. And it's impossible to achieve some of it. And the people who are in charge of it are having to fudge it because of the realities of the political situation. And as a result, you know, the people who have campaigned one side or another, the real wingnuts, the backbenchers, the headbangers, as Dan calls them, are having to find a way to moderate their rhetoric and saying, actually, no, this is what we wanted all along, honest it was. And it just isn't. It's just a lie.
And is there a certain amount that still is all to play for? As you were saying, lots of details still to be thrashed out on the Irish border, for example. And Boris Johnson has tweeted that he's met with May and that she was determined that this phrase full alignment that was part of that Ireland issue in the paper meant compatibility with taking back control of money, laws and borders.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Ireland issue is basically going to see the Ireland issue actually sort of move to the background now. I mean, obviously it's still there, but I think what's going to happen now is we're going to see the nature of the debate move away from divorce bills and things of that nature to this core issue of the Brexit end state. And we are going to, over the next few weeks and months, become, you know, bored to distraction with the various models that will be put forward, and there'll be lots of discussions about a Norway model and a Canada model and you know, a Singapore on Sea model. We'll hear lots from the Prime Minister that no bespoke model is we're not going to have sort of an off-the-shelf model. We need a bespoke model, and that's where the argument's going to go. And I mean, Susie's right. I mean, there are big differences between the various members of the cabinet on this, but at the end of the day, I do think they all realise that if they don't get this together, then they're all doomed.
And very, very, we ought to go to the break, but very briefly, just to take in the Times, May bounces back. She's in a much more powerful position than she perhaps was at the beginning of the week.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at the beginning of the week, some people are actually talking about, well, this could be the end of her premiership, and she's finished it. This is the sort of... This actually is probably the high point of her premiership
it's temporary.
today.
She's got to get the cabinet online, and that's very difficult. And they can't have trade talks starting until perhaps February or March next year. And then you've only got a year before Brexit is supposed to happen, in which they've got to have an entire trade deal with a 500 million person bloc. Not going to happen.